Okay, we're going to deal with Leighton's interpretation of Romans 9 here, and the objector in Romans 9, and how he's going to, Braxton says, hey, you're the man, you're the one this is your thing, you wrote a book on it. Now, I have watched I've watched Leighton and his videos on how he's dealt with Romans 9. I've read some of his stuff on his website. I hope somewhere else he does a better job than this, because again, he demonstrates that just terrible exegesis. It's very frustrating. I'll show you in a second, but let's go through this video here. But again, Braxton, I hope you research this more and understand that what Leighton is doing is not proper exegesis. It's just not, and I hope you just use common sense in the way that you would approach the situation and see how what he's doing is incorrect. Maybe there's another place that I've missed. I've seen a lot of his dealing with Romans 9 in debates and in on his website and in now I haven't read his book, but if what's coming out on his YouTube page here is what's reflected in his book is very concerning. Very concerning. Okay, so now let's watch.
Is objecting is a synergist or a monergist, or excuse me, a synergist or a provisionist or a Molinist rejecting against Bignon's determinism. You can't just assume that. You've got to prove it. You've got to demonstrate it. And I'm not saying that he has other articles or maybe books or something that he does do this, but he doesn't do it in his book. Okay,
in much of her material, I've watched hours of her material, and a lot of that has been on Romans 9. I don't know what you've done in your book, but what you're doing here and what you do in your on your YouTube page is very bad. Okay, so I'll try to give you the benefit of the doubt there and be gracious, but this is very concerning.
And he doesn't do it in this broadcast, and so that's what we're responding to. And so let's look at the Calvinistic interlocutor here. The Calvinist interlocutor, he assumes, is a synergist, somebody who thinks it's both people have a determinative will. In other words, both wills are in play here. A synergist objecting against double predestination, i.e., determinism. And so
it's not necessarily a synergist. You could be a monergist and reject it. You could be someone who's a determinist in another sense, who doesn't believe in free will at all, like you would believe it. Now, in this situation, yes, he would say that the synergist, the libertarian free will synergist who makes this objection, because you can actually be a libertarian free will and not make this objection. Okay? So that's a little confusion there, but yes, I think the French philosopher is focusing on the synergist. It's one of their stripe, the synergist of their stripe.
Who he thinks Paul is anticipating, who is fighting against his views of double predestination. And so this is the concept that God predestines some people to hell and other people to heaven before they've done anything good or bad, unconditional of any choices they make throughout their life, unconditional of their faith or anything else, because ultimately he's the one who's controlling the good and bad and the faith they end up having, and therefore he's ultimately the one who's creating some for good and some for evil. And therefore, the interlocutor in Bignon's mind is this synergist objecting against double predestination.
Not necessarily, but...
and what we're proposing is that's not the interlocutor at all, not in the mind of Paul here. That the interlocutor instead is more likely a hardened Israelite who was cut off not arbitrarily or unconditionally before he was ever born.
Okay, now we're going to deal with his treatment of Romans 9 here in a second, but I want to read you. The objector here is saying, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault for who resists his will? Because God has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault for who resists his will? The objector is saying, well, if it's his will for me to be this way, why am I to blame, basically? That's it, if it's his will. And then he responds, on the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? Now he says, this is the Calvinist, the bad Calvinist or whatever, says that this is an unconditional election, right? That is what is being taught here. That if God wills that you be one of the elect, that you be one of the vessels of mercy, you will be. And if God wills you be a vessel of wrath, you will be. A vessel of mercy prepared for glory. The reason why we believe this, is because it says it right here. What you'll find throughout is Paul juxtaposing to people or groups all throughout. Now, I see all of the people that are for the synergist or the libertarian free will advocate trying to twist and go, well, he switches here or whatever. The juxtaposition is clear. It's Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Moses and Pharaoh, then vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy prepared for glory. At the end, the vessels of wrath prepared for glory, that's what happens in Romans 8 with the people in the golden chain, I've dealt with that in another video of his dealing with the golden chain. Vessels of mercy prepared for glory are those going to eschatological glory in the new kingdom or heaven, however you want to put it, right? Now, look at what Paul, so those groups, he's dealing with salvation. It's clear. And he talks about how the Jews are not saved. He wishes that he was accursed, cut off, separated for the sake of his kinsmen, obviously, so that they will accept and not be cut off, and they would be saved. Verse 10 and 11, and not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born, or had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose, according to his choice or election, would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older will serve the younger. Just as is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be. So he goes on, that's the first objection, and then the later objection is going to go, and he's going to talk about how God has sovereign, he can choose who is, he puts his mercy on and his grace. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, the twins, they didn't do anything good or bad. God chose Jacob over Esau before they had done anything good or bad or were even born. And obviously this implies that Paul is saying God chose one over the other, not because of what they were going to do or foreseeing something or anything like that. He chose one for his purpose in election. Okay, now let's listen to how he treats this, and he goes to Romans 3.
But according to Romans chapter 11, verse 20 through 23, he was cut off for his unbelief.
Okay, and that's the thing too. This is a problem we have with Leighton. Now we're going to deal with this more when he deals with Romans 3.
In other words, much like the analogy we used before of the alcoholic, a person was not born an alcoholic, but they can become an alcoholic if they continue down that path. Well, in the same way, someone's not born already hardened and cut off.
Okay.
But they can become hardened and cut off if they continue in their unbelief and they continue rejecting the revelation of God and his provision. And this is the condition of many of the Israelites, generally speaking, in the time of Paul. And so a hardened Israelite who's cut off for his unbelief, who is now being used in that rebellion to bring about the redemption of the nations of the world so as to bless all the families of the earth, that would be the person who might be crying out, then why am I still to blame?
No, he's talking about salvation.
If your plan is being accomplished through my rebellion, then why are you to blame me? That's the interlocutor. And I know that's
he's saying that the vessels of wrath, which he's going to talk about, that are going to hell, the vessel of wrath is saying, why am I to blame for who resists his will? This is the vessel of wrath. And then the juxtaposition is with the vessel of mercy prepared for glory. Okay, now here we go.
Interlocutor, because I think that's what we see demonstrated, and I want to share this other screen here. I think you see it demonstrated in the scriptures, especially when you look at someone like Romans chapter 3, verse 1. Let me pull this in here. It says, what advantage has the Jew? Or what benefit?
Okay, this is why many Reformed exegetes cannot take him seriously anymore. He's a beloved brother. He's, according to the law of charity, we should assume he's going to heaven. He's great, but he cannot do exegesis. This is not how you do exegesis. This is not how you do it. Now, you think of exegesis as concentric circles. You deal with the immediate context first, and maybe he's dealt with that in another book that I've never seen, but I've listened to a lot of his content. And he does this all the time when doing exegesis. He'll go somewhere else that sounds like what he wants to believe, and he'll interject it into the text that's right there. And they may not be related, they may be related in little ways, but he'll try to cram it in there and say, look, this is connected to this. Brother Leighton and those who follow him, Romans 3 is dealing with something completely different than Romans 9. Romans 3 is not dealing with election. It's not dealing with it. It's coming off of Romans 2, and again, right, in the original, they didn't have chapter verses, or chapter headings. Romans 2, it's coming off of the Jew he's just hammered the Jew, right, in Romans 2. And he's going to go into Romans 3 and establish that all have sinned. There's no election. The topic's not election there. It's not. In Romans 9, he does talk about election. From Romans 8, remember? Predestination and the elect. He talks about in Romans 8, and then he talks about God. Okay? God, for though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose, according to his election, choice, would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls. He's talking about election there. You can't go to Romans 3 and try to make that. The objector in Romans 9 is dealing with something completely different. It's a totally different topic. I mean, there may be some overlap a little bit here and there, but the topic is totally different as regards to election. He's not dealing with election in Romans 3. Now, I'm trying to be gracious because I see him, I've watched so much of his material, and I see him do this so often. And then, of course, he brings in a story, like the drunkard and all this, and his analogies and stuff. And that could be fine if you do that appropriately. That could be okay, if you do that appropriately. But his exegesis, where he just goes to somewhere else, and then, he'll do that. In Romans 9, he'll go to, like, a parable or something. And he'll say, look, this connects. And it's, what? You deal with Romans 9, walk through it. You need to think of the exegesis. Again, this is a lesson as concentric circles. You deal, like they say in real estate, location, location, location. You deal with the immediate context first, and you work out. So to determine what the objector is dealing with in Romans 9, you look at the immediate context first. Then you can go out and look at Romans 3 and see if it's related. And here it's not. He's not talking about election in Romans 3. He's not. And then you can go out, what does the person say throughout his whole corpus, the same author in the same book, and then, of course, his whole corpus. Then you go to other passages. And this is just common sense. So Braxton and Tim, please understand, just use common sense, that you cannot bring in something. I could even use something you guys said, a year ago, or maybe even in the same thing, and say, oh, look, you said this over here, and that sounds similar to this over here, so they're connected. And they're this. You would go, no, that's not right. I may be dealing with something completely different in the same essay over here that's connected to this in ways there's overlap, but I can be dealing with something completely different over there in the same essay. So in this book, Romans 9, the objector is dealing with something completely different than Romans 3. There may be some overlap and stuff, but Romans 9 is dealing with the objector's, the objector is dealing with to God's will for him to being a vessel of wrath. Right? So that's the objector in election, and that's the context, is talking about election. Romans 3 is talking about God's glory because we're sinners. Because we sin, right? Because he's coming off of Romans 2, dealing with the Jew, and Romans 1, dealing with the Gentiles. Going like that. And then he's going to say, we're all sinners. And election is not there in Romans 3. So anyway, I'm going to stop there. And this is why I love the brother. I'm sure he's a nice guy, but this is very frustrating when I've listened to him on so many of his things. He does this constantly. Okay. God bless.